nice introduction. I think that Tammy's presentation will be a hard presentation to follow. I don't have pictures of kids and schools and things like that, which is so engaging for all of us who are literacy coaches and really love our work with teachers and students and principals. And but I am pleased to be able to be with you today to share some research that has been done since we developed the essential coaching practices in 2016. So I'm just going to share my screen, I hope. Okay, so today I'd really like to share some current research. But as was the case when Dr. Wright shared quite a bit of her research in August, I think it was, lots of what current research is doing is affirming what we already know and adding a little bit of new information. So I'm talking about affirming and extending our understanding about literacy coaching. I would like to start by having you think about this question. What is your role as a literacy coach? And if I were to ask your principal, what is so-and-so's role as a literacy coach? And then I were to ask you that same question, I wonder if your descriptions would be almost exactly the same, somewhat similar, or quite different. So what I would like you to do is think about this as an individual, but then I would like those of you whose first name begins with a B to put your answer into the chat. So if your first name begins with a B, would your description and that of a principal with whom you work be almost exactly the same, somewhat similar, or quite different? I'm just going to give you about 15-20 seconds to answer. So we've got a lot of people who think it's the same. Oh, somebody says it's quite different. So you already acknowledged that your role will be different. One, because he's new to the district, somewhat similar, but they're having a meeting tomorrow to make sure that everybody has a shared understanding. Okay, so those are some of the people whose names begin with B, and just other people who decided, I want to answer this question as well. Now think about this in terms of your work with teachers. If I were to ask you that same question, oops, sorry. What is your role as a literacy coach? And I were to ask some of the teachers with whom you work, would your descriptions be almost exactly the same, somewhat similar, or quite different? So if your first name begins with a D, I'd love to see your answers in the chat. So now we're talking about your description and teachers' descriptions. So what do you think? Oh, we've got quite different, almost the same, somewhat similar. And you're thinking about maybe this has to do with because I'm new to the building, I haven't really talked to a lot of them, so it's somewhat similar. And others of you who have been working in the same building with the same teachers over years, you're thinking, yes, because I have been in this building a lot and I've communicated a lot. So thank you if you were first name began with B or D for sharing your ideas. So let's look at some research that actually, I call this the question that never goes away in research. There's so much research on what is the role of the literacy coach. And this is a question that never goes away. It's always relevant. And I think because we're always trying to refine that role and base it on research. So this was a study by Woodward and Thoma, who actually went out and they did a survey. This is a typical research kind of design where you first do this large survey of a huge group of people. And in this case, it was administrators, coaches, instructional coaches, literacy coaches, whatever kind of coaches there were, and teachers. And then they usually follow it up with some semi-structured interviews with a small group of that, a larger group who did the survey. In this case, Woodward and Thoma broke apart some of the people that they surveyed, and they only, in this article, deal with principals who worked with literacy coaches, and teachers who worked with literacy coaches. So we're really narrowing the group to literacy coaches. And there were, in this particular case, 424 teachers who said they had a literacy coach in their building. So many of you said that you thought that your role, your description would be very similar to that of the principal and of the teachers with whom you work. And this is what they found. Administrators said, our coaches are modeling lessons, they're supporting teacher and using data to drive instruction, they're providing PD. On the other hand, when asked the question, the literacy coaches said, we spend most of our time providing PD and leading PLCs. And when asked about the teacher, when the teachers were asked what's the role of the coach, they said, well, some of those things, but a lot of them said they help us find resources for us, and they help us with the curriculum. And then a large percentage, I think about 30% said, I'm not sure what the role of the coach is. And these were teachers who actually had coaches in their building, but they still were not sure, possibly because they'd never worked with the coach. And so I think this affirms probably that the role of the coach is not consistent across, the understanding of the role of the coach is not consistent across administrators, the coaches themselves, and teachers. And it really, I think, extends our knowledge about how teachers see the role of the coach, because we haven't really asked teachers too much about what they see as the role of the coach or anything else about the coach. But of those 424 teachers who engaged with, who had coaches in their building, about 251 reported that they engaged in these experiences. And let's just look at how this affirms a lot of the things that we have in our essential coaching practices. So they said, one of the things that coaches do is that they connect our work to research. And remember, both the instructional practices and the coaching practices are based in research. They're supported by research. So this really fits pretty much all of the, goes and is connected to all of the research that contributed to the essential instructional and essential coaching practices. They said we spend a lot of time with coaches supporting co-planning with coaches, and they help us develop our instructional strategies, which is really part of Coaching Essential 6, and especially that co-planning piece, and some of Essential 5. And then, of course, the teachers said that our coaches observe us and give us feedback, which is certainly aligned with Essential Coaching Practice 6. And finally, these teachers said that the coaches supported the selection of instructional materials. And this is really under conferencing in Essential 6. So we can see that all of the things that teachers say, if teachers are engaged with coaches, they say that they're doing these things, and these are all research supported activities, and not only in our coaching practices, but also in other studies like the study by Kraft, Blazar, and Hogan, who said that these were research-related activities as well. So the more that you are with teachers, the clearer is the understanding of what your role is. And so I think that some of the, those of you who said it's somewhat different, might be somewhat similar, a lot of that has to do with how much interaction that you've had with those teachers. One of the conclusions that Woodward and Thoma came to was that for large-scale leadership efforts like ours in Michigan, where we have this large 360 of you here today, plans for establishing a developed understanding of a coaching definition and process may strengthen the impact that such policies have. And I think they're pretty low key in saying may strengthen. I think that it is really an essential part of our work as coaches that we have to have a developed understanding of a coaching definition, and it has to be shared with principals and teachers, and so that all groups have that same understanding of what coaching, what is the role of the coaching. And I think that this study affirms that there is a mismatch in some cases. And I think that this idea of getting to a shared understanding is why we have really been pushing the use of the essential coaching practices when you're talking with principals, and actually also using that video and the facilitator guide we have about how principals can support literacy instruction. So that's one study that really focuses on that never-ending question of what is the role of literacy coaches. And something that many of you are still working with. I was pleased to see that some of you are saying, I've got a meeting tomorrow with the principal and this is what we're going to talk about, or I have I'm going to be part of the literacy leadership team and we're going to talk about that. As we go on to another study, I'd like you to think about what are the qualities of an effective literacy coach? And it is true that some of our newer studies are really focusing more on teachers, which is great because that's with whom we're working on a regular basis. So the last study kind of asked teachers, what's the role of the literacy coach in general, and then asked those teachers who really actually worked with coaches, what roles those coaches played. But this next study is going to say, what are the qualities of an effective literacy coach? So those of you who are, as you're thinking about what I'm going to talk about, what would a teacher with whom you work list as the qualities of an effective literacy coach? Meaning your qualities, because we're hoping that you are all considered effective literacy coaches. So if your name actually starts with where's my chat? A J. There's a lot of J's. I know every time I go to a intensive or something, we've got a lot of Jennifers and things like that. So if your name starts with a J, would you answer this question in the chat? The rest of you think about it. What's one or two qualities that they would say you have and as an effective literacy coach? So collaborative comes up immediately. Good listener, reflective, supportive. Again, a good listener, personable. You can relate, responsive to needs, trusting, confidential, relationship builder, knowledgeable. These are all great qualities. And hopefully these are qualities that teachers say are qualities of an effective teacher. So let's see what the research says. Thank you, everybody whose name begins with J for answering, and a few others as well. Flexible came from somebody whose name starts with an M, but it's a really good quality. So we have things like supportive, responsive, knowledgeable, flexible, trusting, confidential, all of those things that came up in the chat and that some of you were also thinking of. So let's see if the research affirms what we think are qualities of an effective literacy coach. This was a study by Hudson and Pletcher, and I've had the pleasure of working with these two people in another research study that we're doing with the International Literacy Association. So it was fun to read Bethany Pletcher's article on what teachers want, the qualities of an effective literacy coach according to classroom teachers. And in their particular study, it was a year-long study that they did. And you know, one of the things about coaching studies is they're often qualitative. They're often have to do with interviews, because we want to know what people think about literacy coaching. And certainly you can't figure out what the qualities are without asking teachers. So for a year long, they followed these 5 coaches who were working with 2 teachers. And this is just part of their work that they did with these coaches. So they did semi-structured interviews with the teachers and asked them, one of the questions that they asked, or a series of questions they asked, were around the qualities of an effective literacy coach. So these are the responses from the teachers who worked with these coaches. They said they have to have strong interpersonal skills. So I think I saw that come up, and this affirms our coaching essential 3. But a coaching essential 3 has a lot of bullets, but some things that I think it extends our knowledge is that these 2 ideas were not in the bullets, that teachers said that effective literacy coaches respect teachers' knowledge of students, that teachers have a good knowledge of the students with whom they work, and that we're respected because the literacy coach understands that we have that knowledge. And also that literacy coaches respect that teachers are willing to try new strategies to improve student learning. Some of the teachers said that in the past, sometimes they were thought of as being hesitant to try new strategies, but really teachers are willing to try new strategies if they think those strategies will improve their students' learning, and if it's based on what the teacher already knows about the students. So I think that these strong interpersonal skills, of course, we know are important, but could we extend some of the ideas in our bullets from essential 3 to include this respect for teachers' knowledge and willingness to improve? We saw this in your list, so it affirms what you said, that coaches are knowledgeable, and teachers especially referenced their ability to share the research that they have time to keep current about. Teachers think that coaches are much more able to keep current with research than they are, and also that they are able to examine and explore curriculum materials in more depth than teachers have the time to do. And they respect that and feel that that's a really important part of being a literacy coach. And also that coaches are able to make connections to standards very quickly, so that when you're in a PLC or grade level team meeting, if you're wondering, does this strategy that we're using, does it connect to the standards? How does our curriculum connect to the standards? That coaches have the ability to make those connections. So it's something that is sometimes when we're taking time to read a new research article or really spending a lot of time on curricular materials, we wonder, is this worth the time? According to teachers, this is a really important part of what they respect about literacy coaches. And remember, this is similar to the coaches in the previous study who said that they often engage with, teachers said that they often engage with coaches about curriculum. So there's some relationships between those 2 studies that we looked at. There is a concern, however, when teachers say that we really think coaches are knowledgeable. There can be a concern that teachers may see coaches as experts, and we are constantly saying well, we might be an expert in this particular area, just like you as a teacher are an expert in this particular area. But we really want to see ourselves, remember, several of you in your chat said collaborative was a really important quality. And so I think you can address that concern by really reminding teachers as you're working with them that we are co-learners together. You know, this is a problem you brought to me. I don't have a silver bullet that's going to cure this problem, but together we can think through options and we can come up with solutions. So addressing this concern about teachers thinking coaches are too knowledgeable and have all the answers, and so they want the coach to take on that consultative stance at all times, whereas we as coaches want to be in that collaborative stance or even the facilitating stance most of the time when we're working with teachers. One of the other things that teachers said that is an important quality of coaches is that coaches provide praise and specific feedback. But the examples that they gave of the praise that they appreciated were things like, I'm proud of you. They like the coach to say, I'm proud of you after giving a lesson. Or I thought it was great when you. And I can just remember how many times, even at the kickoff a couple weeks ago, we talked about this probably isn't the best language because it's all about how the coach perceives the teacher. And that isn't what we want to get across. And so as I read this, I thought, it kind of, it doesn't, it affirms that teachers want praise, but I think that it's our responsibility as coaches to help them see that phrases like the following are really forms of praise, and that the praise should be in relationship to their work with students and student learning and their own practice. And remember earlier in this study, they said that they felt like literacy coaches respected them because they were willing to try strategies to help improve student learning. So I think that if we can share with them why we're using phrases like this, and that these are really complimentary praise phrases, like your modeling of the strategies really help the students to understand these 4 steps that they need to incorporate when they're reading informational text. Or this was effective because the students were able to, so switching that focus so that they can see that that focus is on student learning, not on what the coach likes or doesn't like. So we do want to acknowledge that teachers say that one of the qualities they like about literacy coaches is that they provide praise and some specific feedback. And this would be a type of specific feedback that is complimentary or praiseworthy related to their work. Teachers say that really coaches understand the nature of coaching conversations, which is interesting because we talk so much about conferencing and how important it is. And teachers also see how important it is. And one of the things they said was they want to leave a conversation with a coach feeling confident and empowered. This is really tied to our Coaching Essential 3, the bullet 6 about being reflective about our coaching conversations and how can we leave our teachers and make sure that teachers leave every conversation feeling confident and empowered, because we know that they want to do what's best for students. We have that positive presupposition. So I just like us, maybe if your name starts with should we have a vowel, an A? What are some ways we don't want to leave those vowels out? It's very hard to, although we can read a lot of words without vowels, but what are some ways we can ensure our conversations have these results, that teachers are leaving feeling confident and empowered? So if your name especially starts with an A, could you add some of those ideas to the chat? So make a plan to start with positive praise and end with positive praise. And that positive praise related to teacher practice and student learning. Focus on specific positive feedback, right? I think that they were very sure of, I think that in the next study, we'll talk about teachers who recognize when the feedback is not positive. Support the goals of the teacher and celebrating those small wins. We might have a long-term goal with the teacher, but every step toward that goal is important. And with a plan or a goal so they know where they're going. What's our next step? And we're sure we're going to make that next step together. Using positive presuppositions when asking questions that mediate thinking. So these ideas from collaborative coaching about what kinds of questions are really going to help those teachers be reflective about what's going well with their work, what are the indicators that are going well with their work. So these are some ideas from people who whose name began with A, and somebody said, Phil, the buckets that they really focus on what teachers are asking for, giving choice and ownership in the goals and learning.
Good, how are you? Having a good day. I am. I'm in a statewide coaching network session.
So thank you for adding those things. And I think it's just always important to think about that as you plan your coaching conversations. How are you going to plan them so that teachers leave with a plan, knowing what the next step is, so they feel confident about what they're doing, even if it's something new and maybe not easy for them, but they feel empowered to start working on it. And so those are some great ideas that you shared. The next study really talks about working with hesitant teachers. And I'm wondering, if you put on your thinking caps, what is one way your work with a hesitant teacher might differ from the way you work with a teacher who's eager to collaborate? Or don't you work any differently with them? And you know, teachers are hesitant for many different reasons. And so you might think about why teachers might be hesitant to work with you as a coach, and how you might work with them a little differently than somebody who says, oh, let's get into this. I really want to work on this particular thing with you, and let's meet tomorrow during my planning time, or let's have lunch together to start our planning work. It's a little bit different from a teacher who's like, I'm not so sure I want to work with a literacy coach. So if you could put in the chat, if your name begins with an M, some of the ideas that you some of the ways that you have found that you work with hesitant teachers to make them less hesitant, more confident about working with you. So Michelle Montgomery says, I want to approach the teacher and say, you know, I'm a learner, we're co-learners, we need to learn together. There's a lot of things I don't know either. Pointing out things that you have seen them do well that works for in terms of instructional practices, research supported instructional practices, or that have had a good impact on their students. Sometimes asked to come in and teach something. Some of these things that people are talking about work, whether you're for new teachers, whether they're hesitant or not. This whole idea of being a co-learner, I think, is important. Especially, and that does work, especially if you're working with a new curriculum, because it probably is. A lot of that curriculum is new to you too. So how are we going to work together to figure that out? And some people are saying you just have to build a relationship with the person before you can really get down and involved in deep work, coaching work. So these are some of the ideas of how you might work with a hesitant teacher. Some of the ideas are the same ideas as you work with a new teacher that you haven't worked with before, because they might be hesitant because they don't know what coaching is. They might be hesitant because they've had a terrible coach in the past who kind of came in and said, this is what you should do. Maybe too much of a consulting coach. I don't mean a terrible coach in past, but a terrible coach from that person's point of view, where they come in and kind of tell them what to do. And they are starting to view coaches as more of an evaluator. So some of these reasons you have to think about: why is the person hesitant? Are they just unfamiliar with the material, and so they're hesitant to tell you how unfamiliar with the material they are? But if you set yourself as a co-learner, then you're both kind of going through this new material together. So let's look at a study that actually talks about working with hesitant teachers. They use the word resistant. It's not a word that I like to use. I very much prefer the word hesitant, because I think that a lot of hesitant teachers aren't resistant to literacy coaching. They're just not sure what it's all about. And as we've talked, we want a positive presupposition that once they know, they will want to work with you to improve their own practice and student learning. So this particular study then deals with a research question about what aspects of relationship-focused coaching help literacy coaches support kindergarten teachers who are initially resistant to implementing reading interventions with struggling readers. This is a small part of a larger study. The larger study looked at a particular intervention called the targeted reading intervention. All the teachers were trained in this intervention, as well as the coaches, and they were expected to use it. And this study only looked at the relationship of the relationship building that was necessary to instantiate the intervention work. And although this is teachers working with students on a one-on-one basis, these are classroom teachers working with students on one-on-one to give them some intervention work. It's an interesting study because it really focuses on elementary schools in rural areas. And there are a lot of rural school districts in Michigan, and sometimes we don't look at research that really just deals with rural areas. The characteristics that the authors said were characteristics of the school districts. These are not necessarily terms that that we all use, but they consider these school districts, they consider them low wealth school districts, had a high percentage of minority students, and received Title I funding. In the first year of the targeted reading intervention program, they looked at how often teachers actually implemented the program with their students. They were supposed to give 15-minute lessons to each student 3 to 4 times a week. And there were some teachers who had a low implementation rate, such that they were only doing maybe 1 lesson a week or whatever. And so they were concerned about this low implementation rate, knowing it wasn't going to really help the students very much. And so they picked teachers who were receiving, who had that low implementation rate to look at for the second year. And they call these resistant teachers. These were resistant to doing the targeted reading intervention program the way that they had been taught to do it. And they had been trained in the targeted reading instruction program. And they picked 4 teachers who had been resistant. And then they also picked 2 teachers who had not been resistant, because they wanted to see what the differences were. And they included, when we looked at the coaches then, both the coaches and the teachers had received a lot of training about The targeted reading intervention, the teachers had received 5 days of training. The coaches had received training not only on the targeted reading intervention, but on coaching itself before they began working with the teachers. When they looked at, they used several data sources to determine what kind of relationship building was going on. So they looked at the videotape sessions where the teacher and the coach were in the same space, and the teacher was doing the intervention with the students. They looked at some semi-structured interviews with the teachers and the coaches, and then some field notes. And what really they looked at over the course of the year, and in this relationship focused coaching, one of the things that they found was that coaches had a consistent presence with teachers, so that they really follow that idea of, if I say I'm going to be there when you're giving the intervention, I'm going to be there. If I say I'm going to be there when we debrief about that intervention, I'm going to be there. I'm not going to cancel. And so the coaches said, we have to show up even if the teachers don't really care if we show up. And that being there day after day, and or however many times a week they were going to be there to coach, because they were there to watch and to debrief at least one lesson a week. They said we have to be there and we have to be consistent. And the teachers, especially even the teachers who were not hesitant or resistant, said that this was important. They said, you know, we know they're coming, so we know we have to be well prepared, and we have to teach, and we have to really reflect on what we're doing. So the low implementation teachers said, you know, in the past year, oftentimes the coach did not come to debrief, and so I didn't think it was important. But this coach this year has been there, and I'm getting to the point where I'm understanding how important it is for me to meet with my students those 3 or 4 times a week. The other thing that they found that was important for coaches was that there were these relationship enhancers, things that enhance the relationship with hesitant teachers. They said empathy is really important. Teachers who were like a low implementation people during the first year said that they liked the fact that the coach had been a teacher and could really be empathetic about what it's like to try to get those 15-minute interventions in with 3 or 4 students a day, and that their coach the first year had not shown that empathy, had just said it has to be done. But this coach really understands how difficult it is and really helped me look at my schedule and that kind of thing. So empathy is really important. Also, even just one of the teachers said she was pregnant while this was going on, and the coach was just very empathetic about being pregnant and having those, you know, having to balance what was going on with you and your body and your home life with being a teacher and providing interventions. That a relationship enhancer is that you encourage people. And I think this goes along with the last study where people wanted to leave feeling encouraged and empowered. And so they said, you know, when these coaches encourage us, we are more likely to continue on and do those other intervention lessons when they're not here. Because the coaches only watched 1 lesson a week, but you're supposed to do 3 or 4. And then this whole idea of authentic praise again, that was in the last study. And this study, these teachers said they recognized in previous coaches that sometimes the praise was not authentic. It just was, you did a good job, or I knew that something didn't go well, but they were praising me for it anyhow. And so this authentic, specific praise was really important to them. And that these kinds of things, having empathy and being encouraging and giving authentic praise, really helped form this relationship so that teachers were more encouraged to implement the interventions on a more regular basis. And the final thing in this relationship focused coaching said that there was principal support for the work. And in some cases, it was a two-edged sword. The more hesitant teachers didn't feel that the principal support was as important as those teachers who weren't hesitant. They understood the role of the principal, but the hesitant teachers were a little bit leery about the role of the principal in this particular intervention, possibly because they had been reported as low implementers the year before. So they were a little bit nervous maybe about how the principal might view them. And so this is always that path that teachers have to, that coaches have to try to balance their work between coaches and principals, and how much you're going to say about your work with teachers. I mean, when you're talking to the principal, you're of course saying, you know, one of my jobs is to support and observe and debrief these 5 teachers in their use of the targeted reading intervention, and I've been doing that. And so that's the kind of feedback that you're giving the principal, and you have to let the teacher know exactly the kind of feedback that you're going to give the principal about your work with them. It affirmed, and this particular study really does affirm that all we know about developing relationships, but especially maybe makes us think a little bit more about how to develop relationships with teachers who might be hesitant or who in the past have not been as well coached as they had hoped to be. And also when working with teachers who are implementing a new structure that maybe the first year was difficult for them, and they just needed more encouragement, more support in order to work that into their daily work. One of the unexpected findings that came from this study was that there was a mismatch between all 4 of the hesitant teachers and their coach during the first year of implementation. The teachers reported that sometimes there was a mismatch in age, in gender, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, race, even spirituality came up, education. And so they felt like this was hurting their ability to work with the coach, this mismatch. But interestingly enough, even though there were mismatches between the second year coaches and the teachers who were working in their second year, even though there were mismatches, these things that being consistent and present, having empathy, giving encouragement and authentic praise, really was able to overcome some of the mismatches that were there. So while teachers saw one of the big problems to implementation in the first year being this mismatch, in the second year, even if there was a mismatch in some of those areas that you see above, the coaches were able to overcome that mismatch by implementing these kinds of relationship building topics. So just something interestingly, and thinking about how if we are quite different from the people that we're teaching in some way, and we probably will be, that it's important to really have good relationship building policy practices, so that you can, those don't become the problem in your relationship, that you can kind of acknowledge that we have some mismatching in these areas, but that we can still work together, be collaborative, and work to help the student learning. So those are 3 studies that looked at the role of the literacy coach, and actually a lot on relationships. As people, I think, find that the relationship between teachers and coaches is critical. And we've talked about that and how it's important to build that foundation, and then really to get involved in some deep coaching, you have to have that foundation. As we go into the last study, we're talking about strengthening the coaching program. So think about if you could look at your coaching program as it is right now, what is one thing that you think would strengthen the coaching program at a school in which you work? Just one thing. And if your first name begins with an R, why don't you put some of those ideas into the chat? What's one thing that would strengthen the coaching program where you're at? So somebody said PLC time. Teachers understanding our role, so that communication. So what is that? A consistent menu of supports. What can we do? And making sure that those supports map onto maybe some of the goals of the school. Principal support, administrative support. So this whole idea of understanding the value of really getting that administrative support. That everybody deserves a coach, but you as a coach can't work with everybody at one time. So, you have to, while we want to get across the idea to principals and others that everybody can work with a coach, not just hesitant teachers, not just new teachers, not just teachers who are perceived as having some needs, that everybody can benefit from a coach, but we have to remember that your time is such that you cannot possibly work with everybody at one time. So a coaching model with coaching cycles would really strengthen your program, you think. Having a curriculum focus in your coaching. So those are just some great ideas about, notice this group, at least, who put their ideas in the chat, really focused on that administrative support and working closely with the administrators and teacher knowledge, as well as really going more into that intensive kind of work about coaching cycles. So let's look at it. The last three things I've talked about were research studies that really focused on the role of the coach and relationships. This one is a resource, a new resource that maybe you know about. It comes from IES. Remember, we had study guides about writing instruction, study guides from IES about what's important about comprehension, reading comprehension, about those kinds of things, and they're really well written. This is a self-study guide for evidence-based coaching. So it's a way to really evaluate the coaching program. Now, when I read this, I thought, wow, we already did this in Michigan. So it's affirming the fact that in Michigan, after we developed the coaching practices, we worked with people from the Michigan Department of Education at that time. Lisa Brown, who's one of the MESA team people, was working for the Michigan Department of Education at the time and was instrumental in working with members of the Early Literacy Task Force and some researchers in converting the essential coaching practices into the coaching model, the globe, as we call it. And part of this early literacy coaching model is the coaching continuum that examines where you are in your coaching program and helps you to strengthen the coaching program. We haven't looked at this resource in a long time, and it could be a resource, maybe Erin or Annie, that we could add it to the agenda at some time. But this resource, as I said, is aligned to the essential coaching practices. So for example, this is one about practice 2 about effective literacy coaches apply adult learning principles. And we had, we took the bullets, rewrote the bullets from the essential coaching practices and said, do you have accomplished use of these bullets? Are you is your school in developmental use of these ideas? Or is there an ineffectual use of these things going on at your school? And then the idea was that you would evaluate that as a team. And this was developed in 2017 or 18. And you can examine one category if you're just really interested in, say, that administrative support. You'd really be looking at essential 4, basically, which talks about the importance of principal support. And then you would make some steps to strengthen that based on what you saw needed some development or what was currently ineffective. So we put this together and have talked about it a little bit here in Michigan. So the resource, the IES resource, really affirms the need to do this and that we're on the right path. Interestingly enough, when they have 4 areas, they have in their self-study, they're looking at evidence-based practices of literacy coaching, which is really aligned to our essentials 5 and 6, our coaching essentials. And many of the ideas that they talk about and many of the items are related to things that we talk about in terms of majority of time being spent with teachers and that time be spent on activities that predict student learning. One of their areas that they want to examine when you're looking at a coaching program is the principal-coach partnership agreements. And so look at how many of you put that into the chat, and they too see it as a really important part, which is their ideas really expands our essential 4, our coaching essential 4. Interestingly enough, one of their areas is hiring and training practices. So what are you using to hire coaches, and how are you continuing to provide them with professional development in the area of coaching? So their resource, I think, really expands our ideas of essential coaching practices 1 and 2. Their last area is on communication, about having this principal teacher coach communication, again tied to some of the things that you talked about in the chat, but also to the research, the earlier research by Woodward and Tama that said there isn't really a good alignment between what teachers and coaches and principals think is going on, and that this communication needs to be really strengthened. And so that's aligned to essential 2 of really of the school-wide and center-wide practices. So the IES resource, instead of having the 7 essentials like we have, they have these 4 areas. And when you go through, you're going to rate each area as important, but not feasible now, which I think is an interesting new thing. We had similar things to 2, 3, and 4, area to develop, partially in place, and already in place. And the important but not feasible now is kind of a new thing. Like, we know this is important, but it's not the top thing that's important. So if you go back, maybe when they're looking at hiring and training practices, they're saying this is important, but it's not as important as really getting these principal coach partnerships underway with the coaches that we've already hired. So maybe they're going to focus on that particular area instead of the hiring and training practices right at this time. One of the things that they expanded that we don't have in the Michigan one is they give you possible sources of evidence. Excuse me. So if you're trying to decide is our program good? Is it developing? Is it already in place? Do we still need to work on it quite a bit? And they say, well, possible resources, then these are resources about the literacy-based practices, the evidence-based practices. So you might be looking at literacy coaches and teachers' calendars to kind of look at, is the majority of time being spent with teachers, and the coaching schedules, and what are the teacher lesson plans? How is that reflecting coach-teacher collaboration? So these are some of the evidences that you might want to gather to really make a good judgment on whether this program is focusing on evidence-based practices. And then they have these great guiding questions about, in determining that, are we documenting the amount of time literacy coaches spend engaging in evidence-based practices? And so do we even expect that there's documentation? So if the answer is no, then maybe one of your next steps is, well, we better do that. Do we know if the literacy teachers are meeting the district school established amount of time that they're supposed to? We advocate that the majority of time be spent with teachers engaged in evidence-based using evidence-based practices. But in this case, what is this district expecting of coaches? How much time are they expecting? So lots of really good guiding questions for each of these. So I think that is a way that the IES resource has really expanded and extended what we have done in Michigan, and something to consider using. It also includes, of course, a consensus rating form where everybody scores it and then gets together to determine. It has a planning next steps form and an action plan template. And if you look at that action plan template and you've been in our coaching network for a few years, you will recognize that action plan template as being very, very similar to the problems of practice template that we did in August of 2018 at the Advanced Institute. So it won't be unusual for you. And for many of you, it will be something that you've already taken a teacher or a group through. So I just think this resource is well worth looking at. I think it's really important that whenever you're looking at a piece of research, reading a piece of research, or looking at a new resource, you're always thinking about, how does this affirm what I already know or what I'm already doing? And how is it extending my thinking? Because you might say, just another research on the role of the coach, or just another research piece on dispositions, coaching dispositions, or coaching relationships. But maybe it isn't just another. Maybe it has some great ideas that can extend your thinking and your practice as a coach. Okay, so we looked at, what have we looked at? We looked at role of the coach. We looked at relationships. We looked at how we can evaluate our program, especially along that principal teacher coach relationship and interactions. But what's missing from the current research or the current resources that we have? And I think what's missing still is, what is the impact of literacy coaching on student learning? We always come back to the fact that we don't have enough research on this. Why don't we? It's very difficult to research. It's difficult to tease apart in a large, if coaching is just part of a project, how much coaching contributes to the results. We have this with state tests all the time. We see an increase in proficiency on state tests, and people want to attribute it to one thing, like we're attributing it to coaching. We're attributing it to this new curriculum that we're using. We're attributing it to whatever. But there are so many things that can contribute to changes in state tests. You know, it could be the coaching, it could be a new curriculum, it could be that demographics have changed. All of these things can contribute. So if we're trying to really focus on what's the impact of literacy coaching on student learning, we really need to have studies that really try to isolate and make sure that what you're looking at is the impact of coaching, or coaching and new curriculum, because usually coaching comes with new curriculum on student learning. And one way that I think that we in Michigan have started to look at this and that we want to continue this year is by looking at that coaching cycle data. We started to collect student learning data related to coaching cycles. So what is the impact of coaching cycles on student learning? And I think that last year we had about 30 examples, and really showed that when teachers and coaches work together to improve student learning, and they look at pre-assessment and post-assessment, that in about 80% of the cases, students were meeting the expectations of what coaches and teachers had planned together. And I think that the more that we can gather data from these coaching cycle coaching cycle collaborations, the more that we can in Michigan help to explain what the impact of literacy coaching on student learning is. So I just want to leave you with that idea, not that everything you do is a coaching cycle, and we're going to talk about that this afternoon, but that the more we can gather that data and that you can be involved in the gathering and the thinking about that data, the more we can answer this research question about which we really need more research about, and that research is missing right now. And it's a very expensive research to do on a national level, which is why we don't see a lot of research published about it. But we can certainly start collecting it in Michigan and maybe even start publishing some of the results from these coaching cycle data stories. So I encourage you to think about that as we move on. And I appreciate your thoughts and your attention to thinking about what current research affirms about our knowledge about coaching and how it extends our knowledge, and what we still need to think about as we move forward with our work as literacy coaches. So I look forward to talking to you this afternoon a little bit more about coaching and to hearing the rest of what's going on for the rest of the day.